What that means is the genocide in Gaza will continue indefinitely. And so long as you have an ongoing genocide with ongoing US support,
it still could get worse, right? It still could be broader attacks, it still could be bigger bombs, it still could be incursions that would be extremely risky in Iran, which we know Prime Minister Netanyahu has wanted for decades. He's wanted a direct Israeli and US-backed campaign in Iran.
It's been a horrible, horrible year for Palestine, for millions of us around the world watching this go down. But here's the kicker, as bad as it is, it can and will almost certainly get far worse before, if it ever gets better. So it's been a year of atrocities, a year of impunity, and a year in which the darkest prophecies and predictions all seem to have come true. The Gaza genocide continues. No one seems able or willing to stop it, and it's entering a new phase. And not just that, but the blueprint of what has been done in Gaza has been, as so many feared, as so many predicted, extended not just to the West Bank, but now also to Lebanon, and drawing in the process over the last year, since the October 7th attacks, drawing in regional actors like the Houthis of Yemen, Hezbollah, and now, of course, Iran. And as we look back today, we're going to try and look forward to see what the coming days, weeks, months, and perhaps years will bring us. So let me just introduce you to our guests today. Both really cool people. I love talking to them. We have Zachary Foster with us, historian of Palestine, a senior law fellow at Rutgers, and is the MA in Arab Studies and a PhD in Near East Studies. I hope I got all that right. And if you do not subscribe to his newsletter, just pause the stream right now, forget what I'm talking about, and do it right now. If you're not going to do it right now, then fine. By the end of today's talk, I think you're pretty much going to be convinced. It's one heck of a resource. Also with us from Washington, we have Akbar Shahid Ahmed, the senior diplomatic correspondent of Huffington Post. And Akbar's writing actually a book right now called Crossing the Red Lines. And it's about the choices, missteps, and decisions made by the Biden administration since October 7th. So I'm just going to get right into it. Zachary, I want to start with you. We spoke earlier this year. I think it was late March, it was early April. And you were pretty confident when you said that Israel is in the process of self-destruction. Do you still stand by that? Do you still hold to that view?
I think since I said that in March or April, the process has only accelerated. Since that time, Israel has opened up multiple new fronts. Israel has engaged in direct armed conflict with Iran. We recall the April-May attack. And then again, of course, when it assassinated the senior Politburo of Hamas just a month or two ago. And so you see escalation on the Iranian front, and now you have Israeli leaders threatening to attack Iran's nuclear sites. And Iran has said already that they would respond by destroying oil fields around the Middle East, which would cause a global economic catastrophe. So that's one front. You have obviously the Lebanon front, where Israel has not only engaged in a kind of a terrorism campaign, detonating communication devices across Lebanon, killing hundreds of Lebanese. In fact, the total death count in the past 2 weeks has reached 2,000. And we've just seen in the past week, Israel has now sent ground troops into Lebanon, where they're already seeing heavy losses. And so the Lebanon front is now open. You have Shia militias in Iraq and Syria firing missiles at Israel to try to bring an end to the genocide. And so those fronts have escalated. And of course, the Houthis in Yemen, the Ansar Allah movement, they're continuing attacks, continuing to close the Red Sea to Israeli shipping vessels. That front is only escalating as well. In addition, you have the West Bank, where you now have Israeli fighter jets dropping bombs on cafes in Tulkarm. We just saw a few days ago they killed 18 Palestinians in Tulkarm. And Gaza sees no signs of letting up, where you have continuing resistance operations. Just this past week, we saw another Merkava tank get destroyed. So the Hamas fighters in Gaza are as strong, apparently, as they have been. So as you can see, Israel is just digging itself a deeper and deeper grave, opening up more and more fronts. We haven't even talked about the economic crisis in Israel, the complete collapse of the tourism industry. 60,000 businesses have gone under in Israel. Moody just dropped Israel's credit rating 2 notches just 2 weeks ago. So you're seeing the complete unraveling of Israel's economy. You're seeing Israel opening up new fronts, engaging in a kind of 7-front war. It's unclear where this is going, but there's no question that the complete unraveling of the society is underway.
But I want to push back on that a little bit. Does that all add up to an existential threat to Israel? Because one could argue that what they've had over the last 12 months, or however long, is an opportunity, a pretext to basically carry on to fulfill whatever they actually wanted to, and that is to take out however many regional enemies they have, and the list keeps growing. They keep adding more names to it, and ultimately it comes down to, and we talked about this last time too, Zachary, is the complete blank check, military aid, economic aid, and crucially political and diplomatic cover afforded to it by the Biden administration. So before we come to that, Akbar, I want to go to you. We know, and we've watched this over the last decades, we know that every American government stands by Israel. But this particular administration seems to be a bit unique, yeah? I mean, I have not personally seen or read about any US administration that is so blindly supportive of Israel, even to the point where it's inimical to their own interests. So what is it about the Biden administration that makes it special, Akbar?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you, Zarrar, that historically US presidents of the last 11 presidential administrations, 9 have actually withheld weapons to Israel or threatened to do so, right? Which we have not seen the Biden administration do. So it is an outlier just by historical standards, Republican or Democratic. What is that about? I'd say it's a big factor is context, right? I think the degree of shock that continues, right, within American society and Israeli society from the October 7 attack is really hard to estimate. I think that's a factor that just, whereas other people, I understand, many observers would say, look, yes, there was this attack, 1,200 Israelis were killed, 40,000 Palestinians, right, 2,000 Lebanese, many, many, many more people have been killed since then. For American officials and Israeli officials who are really bought into this paradigm of the US-Israel alliance, that shockwave of that attack isn't yet over. It's still being felt. And especially the hostage issue is still very seriously being felt. The other one I just say is personality. I mean, that's been what's been so shocking to my contacts inside the White House, across the US government, is how much the process since October 7th has not been a normal government policy-making process. It's been a personality-driven process driven by President Joe Biden, someone who we know is a self-identified Zionist, we know is a longtime defender of Israel's security. That's very common for American presidents, and Biden has said that. But the degree to which he has taken into his own hands any decision on any degree of support for Israel, and how he and his close advisors have shunned others, whether it's at the State Department, whether at the Pentagon, in the intelligence community, people who are worried, right? People who say, even just from an American point of view, forget Israel. If you say, how is it helpful for us to be pulled into what Zachary, I think, aptly described as a 7-front war? There's a lot of resistance, but President Biden, the people closest to him, his Middle East advisor, Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, these are all people who have really enabled the president to have a personality-driven approach. And I think 1 year into the war, none of the goals that Biden had from the beginning are being met, right? Just by his own standards, where he said, I don't want to see a regional war. He said, I don't want to see Israel repeat the mistakes the US made after 9/11, where it got trapped into many conflicts with no clear way out. That's clearly happening. So from Biden's own standpoint, he can't say his policy has been a success, but there isn't a desire to change. And I think that's why we're stuck kind of where we are.
So what kind of pushback have we seen? Because look, I'm just going to broaden the scope here a little bit. The institutions that the West and led by America established, I mean, what they call like the rules-based order, international law, all of that has been torched. I mean, all of that has been burnt to the ground. I admit I'm sitting here in the global South, which we like to call it for lack of a better term. And I mean, I can tell you that the view from here is a very, very ugly one. And surely that's not in America's interests. That's not in America's long-term or short-term interests. So, I mean, again, I get that it's a personality-driven approach. I get that there are institutional linkages. There's also religious ones. I'm going to come to that with you, Zachary, in a moment. But it just seems a little insane to me that America would torch its own long-held strategic interests for the sake of a country, a government, and in fact, I mean, to narrow it down, a man who really couldn't care if this administration was defeated at the elections. I mean, make that make sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that effectively Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has given the finger to the Biden administration multiple times, right? Like they have known that, and they knew that, importantly, Zarrar, before October 7th. I think that's where a lot of the concern and pushback comes from officials and even from outside experts who they consult is prior to October 7th, the Biden administration was saying, we want to maintain the relationship with Israel. We cannot stand Netanyahu, right? Biden didn't meet with Netanyahu for a full year. They worked extremely hard to try to support an alternative Israeli government to Netanyahu in 2021 and 2022. So the fact that they have now wedded their own fortunes, I do think seems extremely self-defeating and is hard to understand for people. I think the easiest way to put it, why they feel the sort of a damage to US credibility, to this order, which, as you say, the US built up in the 1940s, post-World War II. Hubris is the word that comes to mind, right? Because the sense and the justification you hear, as I'm reporting this book out, right, I'm talking already to a lot of insiders, I'm talking to people who are close to the administration to say, look, at the 1 year mark, how do you justify to yourselves what you've done? And some of the narratives that you hear are really tinged with a huge degree of confidence, I would argue overconfidence, where US officials are saying, well, sure, but people got over other bad things we've done. People got over the invasion of Iraq. People got over Vietnam, right? And the world still wanted to have a relationship with us. Now, the tectonic plates of geopolitics have shifted, even since the invasion of Iraq. I think the global South's influence and kind of frustration with the West has grown. And I think that's why you see a lot of people, if we're talking about pushback, you see other European countries trying to inch away a little bit. Some European countries have recognized the state of Palestine, Spain, Norway, Ireland. The French have really been pushing hard for a ceasefire, now have called for stopping arms shipments. So there is a kind of fracturing even within the US alliance system. And then within government, I think there's a real hope, whether it's President Harris or President Trump, that at least there'll be a conversation around expertise and trying to rebuild some of these links. Is that possible if there's active warfare and Gaza-style bombing in Lebanon, potentially Iran, potentially Yemen? I don't know, but I think that's the hope, right? The hope is that they can build back.
And I mean, like you said, right? I mean, people will get over it. I mean, it's no big deal. I mean, we've stirred stuff up in the world before, and I mean that hasn't made any difference. Do you think that people are going to get over it, Zachary? I mean, let's take a long view here, right? It's been a year. we've seen the kind of discourse about Israel in the West that I've never seen before. I mean, we've seen people stand up and question young people, Muslims in the West, crucially a lot of young Jewish people, if not now, and so on and so forth. All these organizations, they're out there. Do you think that they're just going to get over it? Do you think there's like a sense of defeat, frustration, apathy, even fatigue now?
No, I think the situation will get much, much worse for Israel. And I think that the difference between some of these previous violations of international law and international humanitarian law that we saw in the U.S. invasion of Iraq, when we saw with the U.S.-backed war on Yemen, the difference now is that those wars ended. This war is going to keep going. Israel is going to be in Gaza forever. This is going to be a permanent occupation. The Israeli troops are setting up military bases in the Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia corridor. They're not going anywhere. They're entrenching themselves in. What that means is the genocide in Gaza will continue indefinitely. And so long as you have an ongoing genocide with ongoing U.S. support, an ongoing military shipments, not every week or two, but literally every single day, another plane takes off from the United States to Cyprus, where weapons are being sent. Then the shipments continue on to Israel. Those shipments are going to keep going, right? And the U.S. will continue to veto UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Yeah, the U.S. will continue to provide Israel diplomatic support at the UN. So the problem isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's only getting worse, because the thing about genocide and the thing about intentionally starving millions of people is, you don't recover from these kinds of, you look at the populations of Gaza, they're in the brink of starvation for a year. Those people are only going to get more sick, more diseased, more unhealthy. There's no healthcare in Gaza. It's not coming back. Right? So there's going to be continuing suffering. There's going to be continuing starvation. There will be continuing aerial bombardments in Gaza. And now you have Lebanon, where Israel is pursuing a kind of Gaza 2.0 strategy, right? They're telling Lebanese to evacuate from areas in Sidon. They're dropping bombs. You just saw today, they're dropping bombs in Tripoli. They're literally they're pursuing the Gaza plan, not just in South Lebanon, but literally everywhere in Lebanon. So you're seeing the war expand, which means, and it's not just a war in Lebanon, it's mass murder. They're dropping 2,000 and 5,000 pound bombs in densely packed residential neighborhoods, bringing down entire blocks of apartments in a single airstrike. And this is ongoing. So the situation is only getting worse, which means the resistance, both in the US on college campuses, as well as abroad in the global South, that will only intensify. So things will only get worse for Israel. And so I don't see this. I don't see the situation improving. No, this is going to get much, much worse.
So that the optimism in certain circles in the Biden administration may be terribly misplaced. I suppose that also happens, right, when you are so shielded from the consequences of your actions. I mean, that's the distance itself creates a certain, dichotomy. Now, Akbar, what Zachary's talking about, right? And we have seen, undoubtedly, we've seen a massive outpouring of public sentiment across the world in support for Palestine. I was looking at some polls, and granted, there's a lot of polls and there's a lot of room for error, talking about the attitude of the US voters. And I believe it was about A, a ceasefire, and B, about conditioning, if not banning, and enforcing that condition on military aid to Israel. And it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that a significant part, if not a majority, in some cases a majority of voters, are in favor of a ceasefire, are not in favor of unconditional arms supplies to Israel. Now, were this any other issue, you would have seen the politicians follow the public pulse, right? Why is there such a gap between what the people seem to want and what the politicians clearly do not want to give it to them? I mean, I don't think that the US Congress has ever given as many standing ovations as they did to Netanyahu. I mean, what explains that? Is it just AIPAC money, or does it go beyond that?
Yeah, the standing ovations were unbelievable. I was in the room that day when that was happening, when Netanyahu spoke, and to see US lawmakers like a jack in the box, right, go up and down again and again from both parties was really. I've been there for addresses from other foreign leaders. It is unusual, and particularly given that Netanyahu at this point is accused at the ICC of war crimes, really striking. I think your supposition is correct in that more Americans, yes, have said they want ceasefires consistently. That number has ticked up and been at a majority number now since February, which means we're at a kind of 7-month lag, right, where policy is not chasing public opinion. And particularly that's high among, yes, Muslim and Arab Americans, but also specifically young people, right, people under 35. That's very much the majority view. What's the disconnect? Why is it not coming through? I think donor money is a big factor, what you mentioned, right? The ardently pro-Israel community. I think fear is a really big factor linked to that. So it's not just, I think people often see this relationship as, oh, these politicians are bought and paid for. I think there's another kind of aspect to it, right? Which is not just that you're courting necessarily campaign contributions from pro-Israel donors. Even if you are not in any way connected to a universe of pro-Israel donors, you could be extremely afraid that they are willing to spend 5 or 10 or whatever amount of money, $5 or $10 million or whatever amount of money to defeat you, right? There's that fear very much among politicians. And since the conversation hasn't gone to this place before, there isn't a playbook or a roadmap for politicians to say, I can kind of stand up here and I'll be safe.
Uncharted territory.
Right.
For politicians.
All of that said, I mean, I know from far away it can seem minuscule and it hasn't shifted the needle on policy, but I have been struck, Zarrar, by the fact that you now have, dozens, if not almost 100 Democratic lawmakers in Congress calling for conditioning weapons and enforcing conditions. There has been a shift. Nancy Pelosi, of all people, has come out in April saying, I want to cut off some weapons. So, I mean, there is a change. It's slow, but there is a change that is being reflected in the political discourse.
There's another thing that I've been seeing now. I mean, admittedly, I'm viewing this at a distance, right? I'm looking at news reports. I'm looking at social media. There's like a whole debate on the Israeli lobby, on it seems to be on AIPAC in the public sphere. How new is that for America?
Well, so I think it existed before, right? And it's a pro-Israel lobby. It's not necessarily the Israeli government. It's pro-Israeli Americans. This is not.
Right.
There are ties sometimes to the Israeli government, but important to make that distinction that this is not there are Israeli government-funded influence operations we know about, but that's not what we're talking about here. In terms of challenging that discourse, I think it is new, and that's why you see AIPAC and its allies panicking in a way that they haven't before, right? It's only been really important to remember AIPAC hasn't actually had a super PAC running ads, which is like the major form of political interference, until 2 years ago, when the conversation started to really shift. Before that, it was really more direct campaign contributions. You didn't see them get into these like multi-million-dollar ad cycles. That's a reflection of even before October 7th, given the way younger people were thinking about Israel and Palestine, given that for this generation and for this political moment, the definition of Israel-Palestine has been the failure of the Oslo Accords, right? It's been that over 30 years, there has not been progress. Rather than, say, 20 years ago, even 40 years ago, you could still make this argument, which is being made, but with a lot less credibility now, that Israel is, this tiny David fighting Goliath in an unfriendly region. We have to give them everything. Israel is now an extremely wealthy, well-armed country with nuclear weapons. You can't make the case that it's an underdog the US is supporting. So I think that's a big part of why the conversation is shifting. And then I just say politicians have become more willing to talk about being either attacked by pro-Israel donors or being afraid. And that's kind of creating a public visibility that I think is fueling that conversation and that skepticism.
All right. Now we talked about fear as far as politicians go, and certainly there's force of habit, right? We've always supported them, we're going to keep supporting them, so on and so forth. But Zachary, I want to come to you. It's also kind of for a lot of people about faith, right? I mean, I was watching the Columbia University hearings, and it blew my mind. Because there's this guy, I don't remember his name, but he had this southern accent. And he's like, the Bible says that if you praise Israel, I will praise you. And if a curse is that, I will curse you. Do you want Columbia University to be cursed by God? Now, we're conditioned when we think fundamentalist, when we say religious extremists, and, even me, like I'm going to think of a guy with a beard and a turban, here's this guy clean shaven, white in a suit, but no less fanatical, perhaps even more, and certainly more dangerous because, these are the guys who sit on the committees that decide, where the wars are going to be. So how much of a factor do you think that is right now among certain populations, sections of the American populace, Zachary, and also then in the American political sphere?
You make an excellent point that Israel's support in the United States, from a demographic perspective, stems primarily from the Christian evangelical community, which is tens of millions of voters strong and represents the base of the Republican Party. And as you said, we talked about AIPAC, which obviously has a huge impact. And I think AIPAC is talked too much about, and I think Christians for United for Israel is talked not enough about. You have John Hagee, who is an American pastor and an anti-Semite, who basically said the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust in his book that he published.
Balfour was an anti-Semite, yeah.
Right, so he represents a long tradition of Zionist anti-Semites from the Christian right, who believe that at the end of days, there will be an ingathering of the Jews in Palestine, Israel. And if the Jews do not accept Christ, they'll burn in hell for all eternity. But I think most Christians, by the way, don't even have that level of, I think, sophistication when it comes to their support for Israel. They have a very simple reading of the Bible, which says that this is a holy land for the Jews. They belong in Israel. Israel is theirs. And the end. That is the degree of the sophistication for most American Christian evangelicals, as far as I can tell. So you're talking about a massive demographic voting bloc, tens of millions of people strong, who believe this. And that is the primary base of the Republican Party. So there's no question here that theology plays a huge role in the U.S. support for Israel, especially on the Republican side.
So coming to that now, and I'm being told to wrap up, so we just have a few minutes left, but I'm just going to ask you one last question. The U.S. elections are coming up. And, again, the distant view is that, hey, what difference does it make? Republican, Democrat, when it comes to Israel, they're all going to be the same. Is there going to be, do you think, any significant difference in the policy we've seen from this administration, complete support for genocide, complete political cover, even repeating Israeli propaganda verbatim, and a possible Donald Trump administration?
I think you will see a more ardent degree of support for killing Muslim and Arab populations from a Donald Trump presidency. I mean, that has been consistent in his narrative, right? What he has said is, he's conversely said two things, right? He said, at the same time, I want Israel to stop the killing, could make them look bad. Simultaneously, I want them to go harder and finish the job. So I think what we're seeing now already crosses boundaries of international law, of even Israel's past actions. It still could get worse, right? It still could be broader attacks. It still could be bigger bombs. It still could be incursions that would be extremely risky in Iran, which we know Prime Minister Netanyahu has wanted for decades. He's wanted a direct Israeli and US-backed campaign in Iran. Would Donald Trump necessarily greenlight that? It's a bit of a wild card. Simultaneously, someone who says, I don't want to see these huge wars. But we also know that a Trump administration is fundamentally chaotic, not strategic, and could be kind of led down the garden path, right? They wouldn't have a plan as much as the Biden administration has not seemed to have a plan. I think a Harris presidency, also a possibility, presents opportunities in that we have seen Vice President Harris not come out and question Biden's policy yet. We haven't seen her make a break. But we know she does not want her legacy to be about this, right? She does not want to be remembered as the president who oversaw an expanding regional war. And while Biden may see that as an acceptable part of his legacy because he sees it as supporting Israel, look at what I've done for them. For Harris, who is 60 years old and is running not for just the next term, but for 2 terms, right? She has a long future ahead of her. I think she views this differently and would be more responsive to.
It could be if Biden's okay with that being his epitaph, but she doesn't necessarily want it to be front and center on a CV that's still doing the rounds. Yeah, so I think like what we can take away from this, unfortunately, is that it's been a horrible, horrible year for Palestine, for millions of us around the world watching this go down. But here's the kicker: as bad as it is, it can and will almost certainly get far worse before, if it ever gets better. Akbar, Zachary Foster, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today. And that's it for now.